Excellent. So, Alex, thanks for joining me. It would be awesome to get started with a little bit of your personal journey into the world of veganism. What kind of brought you here?
Sure. If you go back about 20 years, I was working in climate change, really. I worked for a media company and was very privileged to sort of travel around the world and coordinate what we did as an organisation with all of our partners. So I got to live in Italy and Croatia and Africa and India and everywhere, really. It was very, very lucky. I was a bit of a budget economy jet setter on a development budget, and at one point was managing a project on climate change, and was flying between Skien, which is just outside Oslo in Norway, and Zambia and Italy and London on a fortnightly basis. And it suddenly dawned, and this was about 2001, I guess, and it dawned on me that I was part of the problem. Innocently, we were trying to work on this project to raise awareness about climate change, and this was 20 years ago. But on the coach on the way to the airport, I realised I was part of the problem, and for me, then that sent me on a bit of a journey to discover the causes and the problems and the issues around sort of the climate, environmental issues. And I'd been a vegetarian, and I'd gone vegetarian when I was maybe about 15 or 17, a couple of times. And a lot of that was actually in response to animal issues, not wanting to, weirdly connecting whaling, whaling that was being done with burgers, in that you could go from McDonald's. That I didn't want to be involved in hurting animals. So I thought, okay, well, I won't eat meat, but as I then, back to 2001, realised that I was part of the problem of the climate emergency and wanting to find out more of what I did, the more then you start to dig into that. And then in obviously 2006, Livestock Long Shadow, the UN report came out, which identified livestock's impact about 15% of all climate change emissions. And then the World Watch Institute report in 2009. And by that time, I'd become an academic and was starting to research it myself. And so I slowly moved more towards understanding that if we want to tackle climate change, you need to tackle animal agriculture. And then actually, the internet came around, social media and Facebook, and access to a lot of imagery and a lot of activism that I didn't know about, that I didn't know existed. Like as most of us do, I grew up eating meat. Very fond memories of going to the butchers. My granddad, when I was a very young child, and so we're socialised into these norms, and we have to be socialised out of them or shocked out of them. And so the combination really of wanting to work on climate change and then becoming active in climate change work, and this exposure to images, particularly from actually back in 2009, 2007, from the Save movement actually, and the work that Anita Krantz and the Save movement did in terms of doing vigils outside slaughterhouses. That made that all of those things started to come together for me, and I suddenly realised that we really need to think about not just animals in terms of an environmental issue, but animals in terms of the ethics of how we treat them, their suffering, and the need to live a more equitable, just and sustainable life. So that's sort of the nexus really of what came together to me to bring me to be both vegan and then an advocate for animal justice and climate justice.
Absolutely. Just something popped into my mind as you were talking about that, and I'd love to get your perspective on it. The work that you did with climate change organisations or organisations trying to tackle climate change, and I'm quite conscious of, within the last few years, obviously the rise of kind of the expose kind of documentary, the kind of cowspiracies and things like that. These they've been amazing at kind of developing a bit of a movement, if you like, well, a lot of a movement, and getting people's consciousness raised into some of these issues. And some of the kind of the big climate change organisations take quite a bit of flack in some of those documentaries for turning a blind eye, for not necessarily seeing, or at least not necessarily calling out directly animal agriculture for the harm it causes. Looking back now, and perhaps with some of the connections that you may still have in those organisations, do you think there is any? Have you seen any movement in that kind of space? Are people starting to think actually we do need to address this more head on?
Yeah, there's definitely movement. Absolutely. I mean, when I worked for the media charity that I did on the climate project back in 2001, so 20 years ago now, the vast majority of people there were veggie or vegan. They were the first vegans I ever met. But it wasn't a central issue. It wasn't a central question. As I said, this was 5 years before the UN report, Livestock's Long Shadow. People just didn't really know about the environmental impact, or it wasn't clear, it wasn't obvious. And so there has been, a lot of movement. I think I was involved with Animal Rebellion back in 2019 in terms of getting that off the ground and shaping that narrative, which was a system change narrative around moving towards a plant-based food system, rather than relying on the successful but calls for individual lifestyle change, like Veganuary and Challenge 22. Very successful, very important, but we need system change as well. And Animal Rebellion and the work that we've done over the last couple of years there has definitely shifted the conversation so that it is now in a way more feasible and acceptable for mainstream environmental groups to make those calls as well. Because it is just so mainstream now. You've got the National Food Strategy calling for reductions in meat. You've got the majority of food policy experts and organisations and mainstream environmental groups in the UK and globally calling for reductions in meat. And you've got the UK Committee on Climate Change and their land use report calling for a reduction in animal agriculture and meat. So it's very much the conversation and language has definitely shifted. I think what was really interesting, actually, reflecting upon that, is like 20 years ago, I was working with all veggies and vegans. They really cared about these issues. And if we had known then, it would have been a bigger issue then. But the knowledge has taken some time to sort of catch up. Having said that, I actually think, and I've long thought this actually, that food is probably more a taboo subject than sex or politics or religion. You go to dinner with people and it's like, don't talk about sex, politics, or religion at the dinner table. I think talking about food is now something that is really has always been very, very difficult to talk about. Personal choice, personal freedoms, consumer freedoms. These are the mythical ideals at the heart of our societies, particularly in Western consumer individualist societies. So tackling something that people do every day that's central part of consumption, really what we eat, is a very, very difficult subject, very difficult subject to tackle. As you know, as we all know as vegans or as advocates, this is what we're up against, which is why actually the environmental question, the climate, the pressure of climate change, is actually probably the most likely route to the fastest end of animal exploitation. That's not to say we're not doing it for the ethics as well, but in terms of strategy, it's probably that is proven to be the route that has shifted more conversations.
The one that arguably feels more pressing, more tangible to the average person on the street, particularly with what we're seeing right now in the media.
Absolutely, yeah, because, people can get behind environmental change, the climate crisis. We need to change, we need to protect for future generations. It's much more difficult because actually it's easy to have those conversations. It's still quite difficult to bring about behaviour change. People still drive in their cars. People still have washing machines. People still want to go on their holidays. Although obviously that is stratified by class and wealth. Yeah. Obviously, 15% of people make 70% of all the flights. So there's these are complex questions. But people can get behind the conversation more easily than they can behind cutting meat and animal products out of their diet. Although obviously, actually, a third of the UK have identified as flexitarian, wanting to reduce their animal product intake for ethical or environmental reasons. So, there are definitely shifts. There are huge shifts happening.
Which one do you think they kind of have to be hand in hand? There has to be an equilibrium between this, like almost the winning of the hearts and minds and the legislative change. Almost like we've seen a lot of this with COVID. I suppose we've seen it on repeat throughout history with governments seeking re-election, seeking to win popularity contests, if you like, that often support for something like a national lockdown only comes once there's a sense that the hearts and minds have been won. Do you think that the two things are completely interlinked, and absolutely we need to come at this from both angles, the legislative and then the personal?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the National Food Strategy this week has provided evidence of that. I mean, Henry Dimbleby has been a very authentic, honest, powerful force for change in that report. We need to eat 30% more fruit and veg. We need to eat 30% less meat, and that's a mainstream view. And the government have gone, oh, no, not having a sugar tax. Daily Mail have jumped on it, calling it a fat tax. You know what I mean? And a huge amount of very robust and clear thinking will be dumped by the wayside because the government isn't interested. And in writing my report for the Vegan Society that came out last week as well, in the same week, I had conversations with MPs and a lot of people within the food system, in the food policy world, basically saying meat tax is just not politically possible. It's just not politically possible, even though it would really work. It could really work, and there'd be a great deal of a great deal of reason to bring it in. If it's not politically possible. So yeah, it does go hand in hand, and you've got to shift what the common sense is, what is possible or makes sense in common sense. Like the conversations that people have over the dinner table with family, with friends. Is it possible there? Do they get behind it? And if they do, then politicians, it becomes much easier for them. Yeah, that isn't to say we can't make legislation that only based on public will or public acceptance, but they do certainly around something as sensitive as what we eat. They do go very much hand in hand. Yeah.
Thinking about this piece of work, obviously you said like the planting value in our food system report came out last week. Talk us through a little bit of the kind of the current state of affairs with the food system and why we absolutely do need to change.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't really like the, even though I've probably used it myself, the idea of saying that the food system is broken. It's like a metaphor. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? And one, I don't want to get into that whole heroic sense of it's broken, we're here to fix it. Do you know what I mean? It's not reprogramming or recalibrating, although I don't like that word recalibrating after it's obviously come out in the news today about Boris Johnson, his thoughts about the NHS. But essentially the food system we have, the way I like to think about it is if we were sitting down with a blank sheet of paper today, no one, not a single person would design the food system that we have now on that blank sheet of paper. No one would do it because it is inefficient. It doesn't reward anyone, the farmers, the consumers, the citizens, and it's deleterious. It is destroying our soil and land. That's the food system we have. It is not fit, fair, valuable. It's not full of value and it's not sustainable. So if you look at some of the top line statistics just from the UK, poor diet kills as many people as smoking. 1 in 7 people in the UK because of their diet. 4 million people, mainly children, are in food poverty in the UK, in food insecurity. More people than ever are using food banks. At the same time that we've got one of the highest rates of obesity in the Western developed world. And in the UK, nearly or above half of our diet is ultra processed food. And you compare that to Italy or Germany or Portugal, where it's 11% or 14%. An ultra processed food is terrible for us in a few ways because there's no nutritional value in it. it's very bad. There's some of the ingredients incredibly bad for us, and also in terms of value, like the small thin layer of actual agricultural food production at the bottom, the potatoes, the carrots, etc., all of the things that might go in a TV dinner veggie lasagna, get a tiny amount of the money that you pay for it when you buy it from the supermarket. Because when it's ultra processed, it goes through 6 or 7 or 8 layers of processing, and each of those processors needs their slice of the value. So the actual price of food is higher than it should be because of that ultra processing, and that processing reduces all of the nutritional value in it as well, and it's very bad for us. And that's half of the UK diet, which is why we're unhealthy, why diet costs so much to the NHS, and why we've got some of the highest rates of obesity and food poverty in Europe. So the food system we have is not fit for purpose. No one would design it the way we have now. And then you come to the animal question. Like what role would animals play in this? And obviously for vegans and vegan advocates, animals would not be in any exploitative position in that food system at all. They wouldn't come onto that bit of paper until the very end, and then maybe just to provide their poop, wandering freely around the fields, stewarded, cared for, let to live out their full lives, but contributing because their manure is incredibly valuable. If they choose to walk in the field and have a poo, it's fine. And the food system that we do need on that new bit of paper is one where we're investing huge amounts of money in research and production and value in fruit and veg and nuts and beans and legumes and pulses, all of which that we can grow here, but which we don't. Or not enough, not enough. 1% of subsidies goes into fruit and veg production in the UK, and the majority of it goes into sort of animal farming. At the same time, though, that animal farming is becoming much more industrialised and destroying the soil, destroying our rivers, destroying, through runoff and pollution, and obviously is destroying the lives of the animals within it. So we need to reprogram our food system so that we are sovereign, secure and sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a question just about the processing piece before we move on with the plan itself and what it kind of looks like. Because you're absolutely, when you think about it like that, though, there's kind of 6, 7, 8 levels of processing. The nutrients being stripped out of foods, the prices going up on them, etc. as well. So this lose situation. I'm just, and this may be a very, very naive question, but I'll ask it anyway. There's a rise in vegan processed foods, whether it be ice creams and fake meats and all these kind of different things. And I think, us in the sort of vegan community see them as this, potential sort of almost a lure into folks in the sort of the mainstream omnivorous world. They give a sort of a, if you go for an 80-20 rule in your diet, they give you that 20% that you might feel like you've missed of the treat foods, etc. Do you think there is a danger of the same food system swallowing up some of the kind of or swallowing up some of the vegan brands, if you like, and creating some almost a new health problem with different food types? Or is that kind of a misplaced concern, do you think?
No, I would say it's a real concern. I do think it's a real concern, and it's, in a way, it's one of the areas of agreement with those who are looking at the food system seriously. Whether you're vegan or carnist, but if and absolutely, I was going to say that 80-20 rule as well. No one needs to eat whole food, plant-based, healthy 100% of the time if you don't want to. 80-20 is a fairly healthy, normal, approach to it. But imagine if we were having this conversation in, say, Italy, where the processed food, ultra processed food in their diet is 10-12%. And say then the rise of plant-based in their country, in their culture, in their production processes, that the plant-based foods replaces that 10 or 12%, rather than in the UK where it's 50%. The problem isn't that it's plant-based. The problem is that it's processed, and that we have a system that leads to in the UK, highly ultra processed foods, and that's the kind of market. That's what we sell to people. That's the way we advertise to them. That's the way we market to them. That's what we, that's the way we've driven culture. People don't cook, from scratch. So if people were cooking from scratch, for example, like they do in Italy, the skills that are taught in schools there to children, how to cook, the plant-based foods that were on the rise there, that they would be eating, would only be 10% ultra processed rather than 50% ultra processed. So the problem is not the plant-based revolution, the increase in plant-based foods. The problem is the system in which those producers, have put in their foods, make their foods, what's acceptable, what we think we demand, which is really what what is advertised to us. So in a way, it's the other way around. We can use this opportunity to think about how we can reduce the amount of highly ultra processed food that we eat, and if we did that, the producers would produce plant-based food, vegan food that would also not be so highly processed and because that's what we would be demanding, So while I do think it's a concern, and we do not need any more we should not be eating 50% ultra processed food in this country. But the fact that it might be plant based isn't the problem. It's the system that's underneath that, which is the very long supply chains, the very long processing chains, the advertising, the marketing, the kinds of diets that we think we have free choice around, but actually we've been advertised and marketed and sold, these kinds of diets and this kind of lifestyle. That's the problem.
Is this, and if this may be a naive reading of it, but is the situation that's kind of led us to this 50% of processed diets, etc., is that in part a kind of almost a carbon copying of what we see over in the States in terms of culture? What are the kind of the conditions that have led us to that place? Because if I talk to older relatives of mine, and that they talk about particularly kind of post-war Britain and the sort of the dig for victory kind of element, and rationing and so on, and the positive effect that had until it sort of started to fade away. It would be, it's poles apart from where they would probably, my relatives anyway, would probably describe it as an Americanization of British culture and so on, and that's where this kind of thing has come from. What's your perspective on that? Is that a kind of a, do you think that's accurate, or is there another reason behind that?
I mean, for me, I mean, I'm not a historian. I'm not an expert on any of that of the subject matter there, but personally, it feels exactly what it is like. Yeah, it is very much like an Americanization. The research that is there that talks about the values that we have as a British culture, a UK culture, are individualist. It is lean. We lean more across the Atlantic than we do across the English Channel. We're not a communitarian, or we're not a collective. We don't have those collective community senses that the Japanese do, the Koreans do, the Asians, other Asian cultures, and we don't have the cultures that you find across Europe in relation to food. And I mean, they call it, whether it, I mean, I don't know really the research, but the cultures of eating in France are very different from the cultures of eating in the UK. That's one of the, I don't know whether, that anecdote or hypothesis that French people don't get heart disease because of the way they eat, because they eat slowly when they eat together. But I did live in Italy, and the food culture in Italy is so different from the food culture in the UK in terms of what we eat, how we eat, when we eat, where we eat, and who we eat with. And they eat 10%, 12% ultra processed food. We eat 50%, and actually we are very much more Americanized, individualist, capitalist, consumerist societies. And I think some of the really interesting work done by like the Food Citizenship Project and the Food Ethics Council to shift us away from this language of consumerism and consumers to a language of citizenship and citizens. because just that shift in the language is really important in getting us to think. Consumers think of themselves, my free choice, what's in it for me, what can I get cheapest? Citizens think, what's best for the people around me, what's best for my community, what's best for me in this collective. And we need more of that thinking, and that thinking will help us reprogram and rewrite the story of our food system, which is what we need to do.
On that note, do you think we're on a bit of a knife edge in terms of, when I think about culturally where we're at now, Freedom Day and, kind of the various reactions to that kind of thing. You've got the folks, and I'll oversimplify this just to ask the question, but you've got, the sort of the right, if you like, who are, advocating for, quote unquote, this kind of freedom sense, and they're having their liberties taken from them by mask wearing and then on the left you've got, well, that's a kind of community action, to wear a mask is for others, to vaccinate is for others, this kind of thing. And it feels like we're on a sort of almost a knife edge culturally as to which way we go. If I think over to the US election, and again, it felt like a push and a pull between those two kind of ideologies of I could argue whether you'd say Biden's still part of the same system and so on and so forth, but ultimately, that's how it was at least portrayed. Do you see it like that? Do you that we're on this kind of there is a tug of war going on as to which way we go, and actually this is intrinsically linked to the success from a hearts and minds point of view of a plant-based food system in the future?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think I was having this conversation with some people recently, and I think my answer was, and Americans actually, my American friend who had come over to the UK to visit family. My sense is that actually people are still, in the UK, most people still really, people really care about their family, really care about their friends, really care about the people in their street most of the time, care about their work colleagues, and actually when there is opportunity to show real care, compassion, altruism, charitable work, thinking of others, when our society and the structures within which we live are set up to enable those things flow, and they flow much more easily. So I think a lot of that care, compassion, altruism, kindness, generosity, it is there. Absolutely. People really show that. I just think that the systems that are driven by the development of capitalist structures don't allow those flows to saturate culture. Culture is saturated by messages of individualism, individualistic practice, competition rather than collaboration. All of these. So, and that's driven, and it suits some politicians to play up on that, drive cultural wars. Because that's actually the way that the system works as well. Those with power get more power. Those with capital get more capital. Those with money get more money. So it benefits them to maintain those kinds of structures and messages. But I don't know. It's really my sense is there is a huge amount of opportunity and potential. Just not even latent. It's just in the way that people want to live, which is with compassion, which is with kindness, which is with needs of community and service as much as individual security and sustainability. There's that interesting story about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which puts self-actualization at the top, whereas actually it's all about moving towards an individualist approach. And actually what he did was stole and completely bastardized the knowledge from native indigenous American cultures that had that triangle the other way around. It was all about serving your community. actualising yourself to be able to serve your community and actually build collaborative cultures and structures. So, we've got an awful lot to relearn from Indigenous cultures, I think, particularly around food and community and service. And we've got an awful lot to unpick about the unhealthy, unsustainable ways that capitalism structures our social life, and particularly around things like food.
Absolutely. Can you, moving into the planting value in our food system kind of work? We've kind of talked about what the current state of affairs is, but what's the kind of vision? What are you setting out in this piece of work as the possible solution, or at least and I know we're avoiding being the kind of the saviours in this particular sort of vision, but what does it look like moving forward?
Yeah, sure. What was really important about this report was that it was a marker in many ways for the Vegan Society to be an organisation that looked at the food system holistically through a systems lens. So as much as the Vegan Society, so I was a commissioned author. I'm an academic. I was a commissioned author from the Vegan Society to do the research in an objective way, as much as I could as a vegan, and contribute that into the policy team at the Vegan Society, so that then they could think, okay, this is how the food system is looking. These are the obstacles and challenges for those working in it. How do we look at these issues like health, economy, climate change, just work, broader environmental issues with the lens of animal equity? Through that animal equity lens, but thinking about how that impacts upon health or economy. And in many ways, that the format and the approach is a part of the solution. It is the vision, because I don't think many people, certainly not within the food policy space, is that you can't approach it just through one issue. You can't say we need to fix the food system because of health. You can't just fix it because of the climate. You can't just fix it because of just work and labour and value. You need to take all of these things into account if it's going to be sustainable solution. And obviously very important for us and for the Vegan Society was to make sure that all of those issues, added to all of those issues, and indeed all of those issues are seen through the lens of animal equity. A food system cannot be sustainable and fair unless it is fair for everyone, and that includes the animals, and in many ways particularly the animals whose bodies are the exploited labour and value in the food system for many. So first of all, it was that process of going through all of those areas, as it were, and bringing a very much a systems thinking approach, a multi-criteria approach to measuring solutions for the food system, and then thinking through the lens of animal equity, how are we going to get to a plant-based food system and a plant-based vision? And that is at the heart of it. The vision for this report and for the Vegan Society is, what policy do we need to get to a plant-based food system? It's there in the report. I interviewed 30 food policy experts, farmers, those working within the food system. Of course, not a single one of them, of course, supported our position of a fully plant-based food system. But what was really important and interesting about speaking to them all was about recognising where the challenges are, recognising where the obstacles are, and also finding the 80% that we do agree on. So when we sit around the table together, we can say, okay, these are the 80% of things that we do agree on. We do agree on people are, there's too much obesity in the UK. There's too much food poverty and insecurity. There is not enough investment in fruit and veg, not enough investment in organic, not enough investment in getting farmers off the fertiliser treadmill. So there's a huge amount in the food system right now that we can all agree on, whether you're an animal farmer or a vegan. And obviously, and then there's 20% maybe that we don't agree on. So that is also an important part of the vision, because there is absolutely no way that we are going to get to a plant-based food system unless we work with others, even those we don't yet agree on, to facilitate the stepping stones that we feel are necessary. And so some of those, so in the report, there are 3 pieces of legislation. And in a way, 2 of them are stepping stones towards the third. And the first 2, these 2 stepping stones, are a food sustainability bill, which is a piece of policy legislation to go through Parliament that we want to lobby government and politicians to implement. It's there in many other experts' opinions of what we need. So National Food Strategy, for example, and also Professor Tim Lane at City University, one of the most widely respected voices on food policy in the UK. His book Feeding Britain came out last year, and in the centre of that there's a food bill. We need more than an agriculture bill, more than an environment bill. We need to look at food on its own as something that can bring the agriculture and environment bills together in a way, to look at it again through this systems approach. So the first piece of the legislation is the Food Sustainability Bill, which would have these multi-criteria benchmarks, targets, measures that would be about reducing poverty, reducing obesity, improving health, improving value in the system for those who work in the system, and also targets to lead to the reduction of and elimination of animal products in the system. So that's obviously our pioneering vegan vision that goes a bit further and pioneers a bit further than what everyone else is saying. They're saying less meat, we're saying no meat. So Food Sustainability Bill. The second one is actually a Wellbeing for Future Generations Bill, which is currently law in Wales. So in Wales they have a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that came in 2015, which means that all government policy has to go through the lens of thinking about how it's going to impact future generations. And this is really interesting as well. Indigenous cultures always had this 7-generation rule. What do you do today? How will it affect people in 7 generations' time? And that's the kind of long-term thinking that we really need. Like you might even call it socialist if you want. Cuba has it. Cuba has a 100-year plan, for the environment. And Wales has a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act to think about, okay, if we build that road, we build that bridge, how does it impact people in 7 generations? Yeah. That would then bring the England, Scotland and Northern Ireland in line with Wales, so that the 4 nations can actually really work together to think about big infrastructure projects and agricultural policy and food policy in light of how it's going to impact future generations. So actually you wouldn't think it's a necessarily vegan piece of legislation, but it's a stepping stone towards thinking, well, what future do we want? And it's because the third piece of legislation is an end to animal slaughter bill, which, if you put it in front of politicians right now, not a single MP would support that. Not even the vegan ones, because they're like, this isn't even practice. It's not even possible right now, so I'm not going to support it. I can't put my name to it. But we believe it's really important to start thinking about this now, to have that vision of what it's going to look like in 20 years' time when we end animal slaughter. What policy are we going to need when public opinion shifts and goes, oh no, we don't want to do this anymore. It's ruining the climate. Oh, these animals are treated terribly. Oh, I can eat a lab-grown burger. I don't need the one that lived in a field for 18 months and then got its throat cut. So we need to start thinking about what future policy is going to be, what inevitable policies we're going to need to put in place the structures to lead to the world that we want to have. So those are the 3 pieces of legislation in there, and there are a couple of things in there that are, that make up the structure of them. So targets for the Food Sustainability Bill and a Food Sustainability Commission to oversee and make sure enforce those targets basically as well. And then in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Bill, an idea of like a plant-based transition commissioner, someone who can oversee from that point of view, like how all of the decisions that can get made under that are impacting this transition, this pathway towards a plant-based future. So, and then in the body of the research, there's about 25 other ideas that emerged out of the conversations and out of the synthesis of all of the research. Things like a nitrogen tax, a meat tax, public procurement, make veganising all the meals that go into prisons and hospitals and schools and everything. So all of the loads and loads of detail within the report of ideas that came out that could be part of these pieces of legislation. And the important thing is that these pieces of legislation are now the Vegan Society's agenda. This is what the direction that we believe that we're going to move in around policy, so that and work on them. Really get into the detail of them so that as and when they are needed, and as and when public perception shifts even more, and as and when the politicians start to think, yeah, this is possible, we can do this, they're ready to go, shovel ready, as they say. And the vision is, a plant-based food system and a world where we're completely free of the exploitation of animals.
Yeah, I think the three that you lay out there are clearly like, very forward thinking. The 7 generations idea that you talk about, it's almost, as you mention it, is kind of baffling that that's not just logical, straightforward thinking that is already in place. I think if you were to ask the average person on the street, are these decisions, they would probably say, well, with a cynical head on, well, clearly the current government isn't doing that, isn't thinking like that. But they would at least, I think that was the spirit in which things were supposed to be done. To hear it's not kind of there at all, and that's something we need to put in place is kind of staggering, but fantastic that it's right in the center of this kind of project. So that to me is certainly an exciting part of it. In terms of, you mentioned there that it being ready for when it's required, when it's kind of needed, called upon by governments, etc. What steps do we as individuals, collectively, when working for the Vegan Society and with the Vegan Society, what steps do we need to take to accelerate that readiness, if you like?
Yeah. It's a really difficult one because, I think, I just read a great bit of analysis of the UK political system from a German journalist, that was translated into English in the New Statesman, that it just makes you despair about the state of our politics. But I also had a great conversation with. I'm an academic at Sunderland University, and I was lucky enough to have a coffee with my Vice Chancellor on Monday, who used to work in Whitehall. Right. In the Department of Education. So he was a policymaker, and he's very interested in this area. And he's got decades of experience of this, and for him, he said, you meet very few politicians who aren't interested in policy, who aren't interested in they want to learn, they want to know what's going to be most impactful. And actually, all of the engagements that I've had with like DEFRA, the civil servants and the researchers and everyone there, really interesting people, really bright people, really wanting to produce robust, useful, impactful and efficient, workable policy. So there is work, that work is ongoing, and it is a lot of hard work to do that. But we're up against a very post-truth, anti-expert, anti-sort of intelligent, like media, like right-wing media, popular media, and populism has been adopted as a strategy by many of our political leaders who are in power at the moment. So that's what we're up against. In a way, what we can do as individuals, I think, is continue to continue to follow the practices that make sure that we align our behaviour with our values. And if our values are compassion, if our values are kindness and generosity and integrity and truth-telling, then we need to align our behaviours with that. So we do call out lies, we do call out sort of deceit, we do become more active as citizens, I think, which is the really important thing. And not only through social, you can actually do it through social media. I think it's really important to do. And I think there are really good people who use social media to act as citizens. But citizenship goes beyond that, doesn't it? It goes beyond just that. It means working in collectives, working in societies, working in groups, to either be active on the streets or to organise or campaign or become diligent citizens with integrity that challenge where society is not being compassionate, kind, honest, truthful, or valuing others. So, because that's the kind of society that will more easily pass legislation. That's the utopian route. The other route is what Milton Friedman, like the economist from the 1950s, said. Is that what you have to do is like, you've got your ideas, you have to prepare them, you have to have them shovel ready, so when the next crisis comes along, and change only happens in a crisis, that when the politicians are scrabbling around for an idea to save their own skins and to save society, they will go for whatever's closest at hand. And if your idea is the one that looks most possible and practical and is closest at hand, that's the one they'll grab. And we've seen that actually play out in sort of COVID. They have just, our politicians are not wise like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. They have just grabbed whatever's closest, at the time. And it's led to, how many 140,000 deaths, So for individuals should not just see themselves as individuals. We do not see ourselves just as consumers. This isn't just about. I am an absolute. I think a fan. I think it's really important that we have consumer choice that is plant-based, that is vegan, and I think the developments in that area are really important. But we have to see ourselves as more than just consumers. We have to see ourselves as citizens, and we have to work collectively, not individually.
Absolutely, the work of Animal Rebellion. Sort of the kind of being part of those collectives, I think is just so important. And as much as some of the tactics have received criticism from mainstream media, it has pushed a discussion and started a ball rolling, I think, in people's minds. So I absolutely think that kind of work, boots on the ground, collective action, those kind of things we absolutely need to do. So yeah, I'm totally with you on that front. I can absolutely listen to you, Alex, on these subjects all night. And one of the places I've absolutely been listening to you is Shift and Signal, your podcast. I wanted to just briefly talk about that, if that's okay, and in particular how Alan Shearer is to blame for our climate breakdown and the issues that we face.
Yeah. That was. It's an interesting. That was like, I love doing that project. It was just like, it was one of those. It was one of those podcasts that's like a series of. It was a series of 8 podcasts that was commissioned by the Arts Council through a great agency here in Newcastle called the Newbridge Project, and it was about producing something that engaged people physically as well, get them out. So what I did was produce 8 podcasts that were also walks around the city, so people could listen. And we did them collectively sometimes as well. So it was also about not just doing it individually, but going out collectively as a group. Everyone with their headphones on, everyone listening to the podcast, walking around, and then we'd all stop at one point, and I'd tell everyone to stop, and we'd talk and listen and look around and stuff. One of them started at the Alan Shearer Monument outside St James's Park, the ground of Newcastle Football Club, and this big bronze statue. And the whole podcast was about engaging people in lived, physical, sensate experiences of climate change. And four, one of the most important things that I've learned through about media, communication, messaging, how you win hearts and minds, it's the messenger. It's the messenger. Like, your message is not going to go anywhere if people do not trust the messenger. So if I wanted to engage working class, ordinary, salt of the earth, like that's stereotyping anyway, but I apologise for that. But if I want to engage people in Newcastle and people who identify as Geordies, I've got to find the right messenger for them. I'm a Southern Cockney. They're not going to listen to me, So it all starts with finding that right messenger. And if you can get the right messenger, actually giving them a message that that is actually something that in the tone that they might listen to, then that is that cuts through. And that particular podcast was about the things we need to relinquish if we're going to find ways to combat, adapt, mitigate, get beyond climate change. And I didn't want to just talk about, relinquishing your washing machine or light bulbs or things like that. These are the big issues, and actually I think one of the biggest issues, particularly around sort of animals as well, but around climate change, is this construct of gender and masculinity that most men identify with completely unconsciously, because actually masculinity is screwing up everything. Patriarchy and toxic patriarchal masculinity is screwed everything, and gender is the biggest significant factor in the exploitation, use, eating of animals as well. So you want to change men, and men need to change around their climate habits and their eating habits and their exploitation of animals, then you've got to find the right messengers to deliver those messages. It's the John Joseph approach. His book Meat is for Pussies, absolutely vilified by feminists, but he's like, I'm talking to boys in jail. You've got to talk their language or they're not going to listen. And I understand both sides there, but the messenger is super important. So if you want to get Geordies changing their habits around their food and around their climate, footprint, you got to get Alan Shearer to tell them.
It is truly a fantastic piece of work. So engaging, like you say, and so and made me absolutely stop in my tracks and think about. As you were walking around the city, and it's amazing to hear that you were physically doing that too, because I was sort of thinking about it from the production point of view. I was like, I wonder if they're actually walking, or whether there's a studio involved there and that sort of thing.
I tell you what, no, it was great as well, because mapping it out as well, because I had to go out and map it out and estimate how long it would take us to walk around places. To do the little bits of interview and stuff, and it mostly worked out actually when we did it collectively. So it's a real joy to do, and actually that kind of walking audio project, I really enjoyed it, and I think it had a real positive impact on the people who took part.
100%. I can imagine it did. Yeah, you absolutely it started making me think about the town I live in, and looking around at whether it's the architecture, the things are named after, the statues, what we celebrate. It totally makes you look at your environment. As sometimes I think it just blends into the background. We don't think about it. Everything was designed by someone with a purpose, with a sense of their own maybe ego involved in things, or perpetuating their own power, or it's incredible. The stories that are told, and they then sort of sink into our psyches and make us who we are as an identity, and it really sort of, like I say, stopped me in my tracks. I thoroughly recommend everybody listen to that series as well.
Thank you.
Really good.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Really good. And I'll pop a link in the show notes for folks to go and check that out as well and listen to the episodes.
Great. Thank you.
Just finally, where would folks go to read the work that you've done with the Vegan Society and get behind that? Yeah,
there's a little microsite there actually. It's called plantingvalueinfood.org. So if you went there, or you can get to it via the Vegan Society's website, and it's 2 reports. There's a little microsite that breaks it all down. You can watch a little video, and there's 2 reports: the very short policy document, and then the body of, and then the second part 2 is the big body of research, which is a longer document. But yeah, please do go and read it, because it took me 18 months to put together. So it'd be quite nice if actually people did go and read it, and take the lessons from it, which is, let's act collectively as citizens to make this happen.
Wonderful, and a great place to end it. And I'd also recommend people read. You can't see it there because I've got a nice sort of a blurred effect, but there's a copy of Pig in the Air as well there. So.
Pig in the Air, yeah, brilliant. Yeah.
So I definitely recommend people check out that the website from the Vegan Society and the podcast too. So thank you so much, Alex. It's been great chatting with you. Hopefully speak to you again next time when we're talking about how these policies have been landed.
Brilliant. Yeah, let's hope so. Cheers,
right,
Jim.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.